And so, Mary Alice, just tell us a little bit about these expanding the Pell Grant to these short-term programs, because we're interested to see, what do we know about the effectiveness of these short-term training programs as far as getting people connected to good jobs, and what does the research tell us?
Yeah, great. Yeah, that's a great question. And, over the last decade, there's been a lot of research on this question of the effectiveness of short-term programs and credentials, in part because they've been growing really fast. And the
Mm.
reason they've been growing so fast is because of sort of the eroding labor market opportunities and job opportunities for people with only a high school credential. So the good news is that this research is really finally starting to sort of clarify a picture. And there are some consistent trends and some consistent findings that we see across different research findings. Um, I'm going to just point to four big trends that are consistent across many different studies. And the
Absolutely.
first is that when it comes to these very short-term programs and credentials, there is tremendous variability in labor market outcomes. You have a few programs and credentials that generate really good outcomes, earnings of 60, 50, 60, $70,000 after just a few weeks of training. You have many more programs, though, that don't generate particularly great earnings, don't generate earnings that are significantly higher than the minimum wage. And then you have a lot in between. So that's a great deal of variability, and it's a lot that the spectrum of quality is much broader than it is for either associate's degrees or bachelor's degrees.
Mm.
The second big takeaway is that there are many more programs on that side of the spectrum where the earnings are not so great. Okay, and there's a lot more of those programs than there are of those programs that actually do lead immediately into very good earnings. In fact, according to a recent study by my colleague, Dr. Monique Sotelo here at New America, and I'm going to hold up her recent study right here about five things policymakers should know about short-term credentials. What Monique found in her study was that for half of the working adults who report having earned a short-term certificate, those working adults make less than $30,000 a year. Okay,
Wow.
so that's pretty alarming.
Yeah, I'd
A
say.
third big takeaway from the emerging sort of research that's coming out is that this variance isn't random. It isn't just that there's a bunch of programs out there and you kind of can't tell which one's gonna lead to good outcomes and which one's not. It's actually quite stable and quite predictable. And here I'm going to cite some research, some original research by my
Oh,
colleague Will
please, please,
Tesfaye at
please,
New
please
America,
do.
right? Which is about looking at non-degree credentials and how they're distributed across the labor market. And what Lil found is that the programs and credentials that are associated with the very best earnings, those $60,000, $70,000 jobs that I talked about, are overwhelmingly concentrated in occupations that are highly male dominated. That is, men make up 80% or more of program graduates or credential holders. These are occupations in fields like construction, automotive, truck driving, welding, machining. These are also historically occupations that have not always been friendly to men of color. Even while being sort of and not friendly to women at all, but also not friendly to men of color. The programs and credentials that are associated with the lowest wages are highly female dominated occupations, okay, at the other end of the spectrum. And here we're talking about a lot of care jobs, childcare workers, home care workers, personal aides, nursing assistants. And again, these are 70 to 80% female dominated, and they also have a disproportionate representation of women of color in those jobs.
Wow.
So there's a broad spectrum, but it is a very stable and predictable spectrum in which the good jobs are at one end and they tend to be very male dominated. The not so good jobs are at the other end and they tend to be very female dominated. And finally, a fourth takeaway is that the employment and earnings for people who with short-term certificates are significantly less stable than the employment and earnings of people who earned a college degree. That is, people with a short-term certificate are much more likely to go through bouts of employment and unemployment over the course of a year, and their income is likely to be much more volatile over the course of a year, whereas college graduates tend to remain employed and have much more stable income.
Wow, that is quite a lot of unintended consequences going on there.